The research vessel Celestial Observer hung in Earth's orbit like a silver teardrop against the black canvas of space. Inside its bioanalysis laboratory, Dr. Zeldar of the Andromedan Science Collective adjusted his optical receptors, focusing on the holographic display before him. The blue-green planet below rotated slowly, its continents wrapped in swirling white clouds. "Preliminary scans complete, Commander," he announced, his translator converting his harmonic clicks into standard galactic common. "This planet's botanical diversity exceeds all previous records in the database. Over 300,000 catalogued species, with estimations suggesting millions more undiscovered." Commander Xylith approached the display, her crystalline form refracting the soft blue light of the lab. "Remarkable. And our intelligence suggests these life forms are passive? Stationary energy converters using stellar radiation? That is the standard classification for flora across 97% of surveyed worlds," Dr. Zeldar confirmed, manipulating the display to zoom in on the North American continent. "However, Earth's evolutionary pressures appear to have created unusual adaptations. I recommend we begin our field study in the temperate regions. The native inhabitants call this area North Carolina." Dr. Mora, a Pleiadian xenobotanist whose skin shifted colors with her emotions, currently a curious shade of violet, floated closer to examine the data. "The atmospheric composition is within tolerable ranges. Oxygen levels are high, but our environmental suits will compensate. When do we depart?" Zeldar's mandibles clicked with what might have been anticipation. "The landing pod is prepared. We'll touch down at dawn, local time. The humans in this region should be minimal. Our target is a protected forest area they call the Great Smoky Mountains. According to their databases, it's rich with native species and largely uninhabited. The descent through Earth's atmosphere was smoother than expected." As their pod broke through the morning clouds, the landscape below unfolded in shades of green so varied that Dr. Mora's skin cycled through a dozen colors trying to process the visual information. "So many chlorophyll variants," she whispered, her voice filled with scientific wonder. The pod settled in a small clearing, its landing strut sinking slightly into the soft, dark soil. The moment the airlock opened, the three scientists were hit by a wall of sensory data that no scan could have prepared them for. The smell came first, rich, loamy earth mixed with the sweet decay of fallen leaves, the sharp tang of pine, and 1,000 other scents their translators couldn't identify. Then came the sounds, the chattering of what their database identified as birds, the rustle of wind through vegetation, the distant gurgle of running water. "Extraordinary," Commander Xylith said, her crystalline body humming with the vibrations around them. "The acoustic diversity alone warrants a separate study." Dr. Zeldar extended his scanning apparatus, a delicate array of sensors that emerged from his thorax. "Beginning systematic cataloging. Dr. Mora, please collect samples of the primary species. Commander, maintain perimeter monitoring for the native fauna." They moved into the forest with the careful precision of experienced field researchers. The morning sun filtered through the canopy above, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow on the forest floor. Dr. Mora approached what her database identified as a Dionaea macipula, a Venus flytrap. "Fascinating," she murmured, leaning closer. The plant was small, barely the size of her manipulator appendage, with jaw-like leaves rimmed with tiny teeth. "This species exhibits rapid movement capability. A genuine carnivorous adaptation." "Carnivorous?" Zeldar's attention snapped to her position. "That's unusual but not unprecedented. Several worlds have developed nutrient supplementation strategies among their flora. It feeds on insects," Mora explained, gently touching one of the trigger hairs inside the trap. Instantly, the leaves snapped shut with surprising speed. She jerked back in surprise, her skin flashing bright orange. "By the cosmic spiral. That was faster than my reflexes anticipated." Zeldar approached, his scientific curiosity overriding caution. "The closing mechanism operates through a hydraulic pressure system. Elegant, but hardly threatening to organisms of our size and complexity. Dr. Mora collected a sample, carefully placing it in a stasis container. Still, it represents a fascinating evolutionary pathway. Predatory plants. On most worlds, the energy investment required for such active mechanisms would be prohibitive. Perhaps Earth's abundant solar energy and nutrient-rich environment allowed for such extravagances, Commander Xylith suggested, though her sensors remained focused on the broader forest. Something about this place made her uneasy, though she couldn't quantify why. They moved deeper into the forest, collecting samples of ferns, mosses, and flowering plants. Dr. Zelthar was particularly interested in what the humans called kudzu, an invasive species from another continent that had spread across the region. "Look at this growth rate," he said, scanning a massive tangle of vines that had completely engulfed a dead tree. According to local records, this single species can grow up to 30 centimeters in a single day. It's essentially a vegetative conquest mechanism. Earth's flora seems remarkably aggressive compared to standard planetary norms, Mora observed, her skin now a thoughtful shade of blue-green. Even the passive species compete viciously for resources. As afternoon approached, they discovered a grove of what their database identified as Rhododendron maximum, mountain laurel bushes. The plants were beautiful, with clusters of pink and white flowers, but Dr. Zelthar's chemical analyzer immediately flagged a warning. "Caution," he announced. "These plants produce granotoxins, complex poisonous compounds. Consumption would cause severe physiological distress even to carbon-based life forms with protective adaptations." Poisonous flowers? Mora's skin flashed red with alarm. That seems excessive. What evolutionary advantage does toxicity provide to a stationary organism? "Defense mechanism," Commander Xylith said, her voice carrying a note of respect. "These plants are armed." Dr. Zelthar made detailed notes. "We're observing a pattern here. Earth's botanical life forms aren't merely passive solar collectors. They're active participants in survival competition, employing chemical warfare, physical traps, and rapid growth colonization strategies." They continued their survey, discovering pitcher plants whose tube-shaped leaves were slick-walled death traps for insects, trumpet vines that strangled competing vegetation, and thorny blackberry bushes that formed nearly impenetrable barriers. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows through the forest, Dr. Mora made her most disturbing discovery yet. She had wandered slightly ahead of the group, drawn by unusual energy readings, when she found herself in a small clearing dominated by a massive oak tree. But it wasn't the oak that caught her attention. Wrapped around its trunk, spiraling upward like a serpent, was a thick vine covered in glossy, three-leaved clusters. "Dr. Zelthar," she called, her voice tight with concern. "I need you to identify this species." The Andromedan scientist approached, his scanners already active. The readings made his mandibles clench. "Step back, Dr. Mora. Slowly. What is it?" "Toxicodendron radicans. Common name, poison ivy." He pulled up the database entry, and his optical receptors widened as he read. "By the first light, this plant produces urushiol, an oil so potent that microscopic amounts cause severe allergic reactions in approximately 85% of human populations. The reaction includes extreme itching, blistering, and dermatological damage that can last for weeks. But Mora already touched several similar plants during our survey," Commander Xylith said, alarm creeping into her harmonic voice. "No," Zelthar said, checking his records. "Those were superficially similar species. This is different. Look at the coverage." He gestured around the clearing. Now that they were looking for it, they could see poison ivy everywhere, climbing trees, spreading across the ground, mixed in with other vegetation. "It's invisible until you know what to look for," Mora whispered, her skin cycling through alarmed colors. "A chemical weapon distributed across the entire ecosystem. Any creature moving through this forest would be exposed. And yet the humans live here," Xylith observed. They've adapted to coexist with these aggressive botanical forms. Dr. Zeldar's mind was racing, reassessing everything they'd observed. I'm beginning to suspect our initial classification was fundamentally flawed. We approached Earth's flora with the assumption that plants are passive organisms. But what if, on this planet, that assumption is dangerously incorrect? You're suggesting Earth's plants are, what? Actively hostile? Mora's skepticism was evident in her tone, though her skin betrayed her growing unease with pulses of orange and red. Not hostile in the sentient sense, Zeldar clarified. But highly, aggressively adapted for survival through mechanisms that would be classified as offensive capabilities on any other world. Chemical warfare, physical traps, poisonous defenses, rapid colonization, these aren't just survival traits. They're weapons. A sound rustled through the underbrush nearby. All three scientists froze, their sensors straining. Something was moving toward them, something large. Native fauna? Commander Xylatha's voice was barely above a whisper. No, Dr. Zeldar said, his scanners painting a picture that his mind struggled to accept. Movement pattern is wrong. It's vegetative. From the shadows at the clearing's edge, a mass of vines emerged. But these weren't the passive, sun-seeking tendrils they'd observed earlier. These moved with purpose, with something that looked disturbingly like intent. Dr. Mora's database identified them, Smilax species, greenbrier. The vines were covered in sharp, hooked thorns, and they were advancing toward the scientists with a speed that no plant should possess. Back to the pod, Commander Xylath ordered, her voice cutting through their paralysis. Now! They ran, their scientific dignity forgotten in the face of this impossible threat. Behind them, the greenbrier vines surged forward, joined by other species, wisteria, Virginia creeper, trumpet vine, all moving in what could only be described as coordinated pursuit. This is impossible! Mora shouted as they crashed through the underbrush. Plants don't have nervous systems. They can't coordinate. They can't hunt. Tell that to them. Zeldar responded, his sensors detecting more vegetation converging on their position from multiple directions. They burst into the clearing where their pod waited, but between them and safety stretched a carpet of what Zeldar's frantic scans identified as stinging nettle, each plant covered in tiny, hollow needles filled with a cocktail of painful chemicals. We can't cross that, Mora said, her skin flashing pure white with terror. The chemical burns would incapacitate us. Commander Xylatha's crystalline form began to resonate at a high frequency. Shield formation. I'll disrupt their cellular structures with harmonic resonance. Move behind me. As she projected her disruption field, the plants before them withered and blackened, creating a narrow path. They sprinted through, feeling the brush of dying vegetation against their suits. Behind them, the pursuing vines recoiled from the harmonic assault but didn't retreat far. They reached the pod, practically falling through the airlock. As the hatch sealed, they could see through the viewport as vines began wrapping around the pod's exterior, testing for weaknesses, probing for entry points. Initiate launch sequence, Xylath commanded, her voice strained from the energy expenditure. Emergency ascent protocol. The pod's engines fired, tearing free from the grasping vegetation with a force that shredded the attacking plants. They shot upward through the forest canopy, leaves and branches exploding away from their exhaust. As they climbed into the safety of space, the three scientists remained silent, each processing what they'd just experienced. Finally, Dr. Zeldar spoke, his voice carrying a weight of realization that would change galactic understanding forever. We need to file an immediate report. Earth's classification needs to be updated. This planet doesn't just have passive flora. It has. He paused, searching for the right terminology. It has botanical predators. And they're far more sophisticated than anyone could have anticipated. Dr. Mora pulled up the data they'd collected, her skin still pale with shock. Look at this. The vine movement patterns, they weren't random. There was coordination, communication somehow. And the speed of response. She shook her head. We triggered something. Some kind of defensive or predatory response from the entire ecosystem. The humans, Commander Xylith said suddenly. They've been living among these plants for their entire evolutionary history. No wonder they're so resilient. They've survived in an environment where even the plants hunt. Back on the Celestial Observer, they began compiling their report, knowing that it would send shockwaves through the galactic scientific community. Earth was unlike any world they'd encountered, a planet where humanity had clawed its way to sentience while being hunted not just by animals, but by the very forest itself. As Dr. Zelthar wrote, he glanced at the viewport, where Earth rotated peacefully below, its green continents hiding secrets that the galaxy was only beginning to understand. We came here thinking we'd study passive plants, he murmured. Instead, we barely escaped with our lives from an ecosystem that actively fights back. Dr. Mora added the last of their scans to the report, her skin finally settling into a somber purple. The question is, what else about Earth have we underestimated? It was a question that would haunt them, and soon, the entire galactic community. Because if Earth's plants were this dangerous, what did that say about the species that had thrived alongside them? 3 standard galactic cycles had passed since the incident in the Great Smoky Mountains. The Celestial Observer remained in Earth's orbit, but the crew had changed. The initial report filed by Dr. Zelthar, Dr. Mora, and Commander Xylith had been met with skepticism, disbelief, and in some quarters, outright mockery. Aggressive plants, the Science Council had responded. Coordinated botanical attacks? Perhaps the atmospheric oxygen levels affected your cognitive processing. But the data didn't lie. The recordings, the chemical analyses, the movement patterns, all of it pointed to something unprecedented. The Council had done what bureaucracies always do when faced with the uncomfortable unknown. They'd sent a second team to verify or debunk the findings. Dr. Kreshenael, a Rigelian xenobiologist with a reputation for skepticism and precision, stood in the same laboratory where Zelthar had first marveled at Earth's botanical diversity. Unlike his predecessor, Kreshenael's 12 ocular sensors viewed the planet below with cold analytical detachment. Local time is 0600 hours in the region designated Louisiana, announced Lieutenant Vex, a young Centaurian pilot eager to prove himself. The environmental profile shows high humidity, elevated temperatures, and extensive wetland ecosystems. Swampland, Dr. Kreshenael stated flatly. Waterlogged soil, slow-moving water, dense vegetation. An ideal testing ground. If Zelthar's plants were truly aggressive, a wetland environment should amplify those traits: limited space, intense competition for elevated ground and sunlight. Dr. Sina, a Tau-Cetian biochemist whose translucent body revealed the constant flow of her nutrient systems, approached the display. The previous team reported unusual coordination among plant species. Have we developed countermeasures? We have sonic disruptors, chemical deterrents, and localized environmental controls, Kreshenael replied, his voice carrying absolute confidence. If Earth's flora exhibits aggressive tendencies, we are prepared. Unlike the previous team, we will not panic at the first sign of unexpected movement. The criticism of Zelthar's team was implicit but clear. Kreshenael believed they had overreacted, allowed fear to color their scientific judgment. He intended to prove it. The landing site was a cypress swamp outside a small human settlement called Homa, in the state of Louisiana. As the pod settled onto a rare patch of solid ground, the morning mist hung thick over the dark water, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that even Kreshenael had to admit was unsettling. The moment they opened the airlock, the environment assaulted them. The humidity was oppressive, even through their suits. The air was thick with the smell of decay and growth happening simultaneously, the endless cycle of death and rebirth that characterized wetland ecosystems. Maintain close formation, Kreshenael ordered. Lieutenant Vex, monitor for fauna. Dr. Sina, begin atmospheric and water sampling. I'll catalog the botanical specimens. The swamp was unlike the mountain forest. Here, everything was fighting for space above the waterline. Cypress trees rose like ancient pillars, their bases swollen into massive buttresses. Their knees, peculiar root extensions, jutted from the water like wooden stalagmites. Spanish moss draped from every branch, creating curtains of gray-green that swayed in the humid breeze. Initial assessment, Cresceniel spoke into his recorder. Dense competition for resources evident. Vertical growth strategies dominate. No signs of the aggressive behavior reported by the previous team. But Dr. Sina had made a discovery that troubled her. Kneeling at the water's edge, she'd extended a collection probe into the murky liquid. Dr. Cresceniel, the water composition is unusual. Extremely high tannin content from decomposing vegetation, yes, but there's something else. Complex organic compounds I can't immediately identify. Decomposition byproducts, Cresceniel dismissed. Wetlands are essentially enormous compost systems. Perhaps, but Sina's words cut off as something brushed against her probe. She pulled it back quickly, and clinging to the end was a strand of what appeared to be thin, reddish vegetation. Utricularia species, Cresceniel identified. Bladderwort. An aquatic carnivorous plant. It uses small bladder-like traps to capture microscopic prey. Fascinating, but hardly threatening to beings of our size. Sina carefully removed the strand and placed it in a sample container. But as she did, she noticed something odd. The water around where she'd taken the sample was moving. Not flowing, the current didn't explain it. It was as if something was disturbing the surface from below, ripples spreading outward in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. Dr. Cresceniel, she said slowly, I think we should move away from the water's edge. Unnecessary, the Rigelian replied, focused on cataloging a stand of cattails. We're here to conduct thorough research, not flee from shadows. Lieutenant Vex, meanwhile, had been using his aerial drones to map the surrounding area. What he was seeing made his antennae twitch with concern. Sir, the vegetation density is increasing in our direction. The drones show plant growth patterns converging on our position. Plant growth doesn't converge, Lieutenant, Cresceniel said dismissively. You're misinterpreting the data. With respect, sir, I'm not. Vex pulled up the holographic display, showing the drone footage from 10 minutes ago versus the current view. The difference was subtle but undeniable. Vines and water plants had shifted position, creating a tightening circle around their landing site. Dr. Sina stood abruptly, her transparent body flushing with alarm chemicals. He's right. Look at the cypress knees, their positions have changed. These formations should be static, but they've moved. Centimeters, perhaps, but moved nonetheless. For the first time, uncertainty crossed Cresceniel's features. He activated his own scanners, running a comparative analysis. The data was irrefutable. The swamp around them had reorganized itself in the brief time since their arrival. That's not possible, he muttered. Plant movement at this scale would require a nervous system? Sina finished. Or something equivalent. Something we don't understand. A sound echoed across the swamp, a deep, resonant splash, followed by another, then another. Something massive was moving through the water, and it was getting closer. Back to the pod, Vex urged. Now, sir. But Cresceniel's scientific pride wouldn't allow retreat. Not yet. Hold position. I want to observe whatever is approaching. This could be crucial data. What emerged from the mist was something out of primordial nightmares. It appeared at first to be a floating island, a mass of vegetation roughly 10 meters across, drifting toward them. But as it drew closer, they could see it was actively propelling itself, using hanging roots like tentacles to pull itself through the water. A floating bog mat, Sina whispered. But they can't. The mass was composed of dozens of plant species, all intertwined and seemingly working in concert. Water lilies, duckweed, various grasses, and strangling fig vines all merged into a single mobile entity. And hanging from its underside, trailing in the water, were thousands of thin, reddish strands. Bladderwort, Cresceniel breathed. It's covered in bladderwort. This entire formation is a trap. The floating island wasn't alone. Behind it, two more emerged from different directions, coordinating their approach to box in the scientists. This is impossible. Cresceniel's certainty was cracking. Plants don't hunt in packs. They don't strategize. Tell them that. Vex shouted, already backing toward the pod. The water around them began to churn. Beneath the surface, more vegetation was rising, submerged plants that had been dormant, now activating in response to prey. Coontail, water milfoil, and hydrilla created a living net, rising to entangle anything trying to wade through the swamp. Dr. Sina's scanners were going haywire. The chemical compounds I detected earlier, they're not decomposition byproducts. They're communication molecules. The plants are releasing signaling compounds into the water, coordinating their movements. That would require a level of biochemical sophistication that, Cresceniel stopped mid-sentence as a vine shot from the nearest floating island, wrapping around his collection case and yanking it from his grasp. The case splashed into the water and was immediately swarmed by aquatic plants, pulled beneath the surface in seconds. "Run," he finally shouted, his pride forgotten. They sprinted for the pod, but the solid ground they'd landed on was betraying them. What had seemed like firm earth was actually a thin crust over semi-liquid peat. With each step, they sank deeper, the ground itself seeming to grasp at them. Lieutenant Vex was the fastest, his Centaurian physiology giving him an advantage. He reached the pod and began the emergency start sequence. Dr. Sina was right behind him, her transparent body glowing with stress chemicals. Dr. Cresceniel, laden with equipment and slowed by his bulkier frame, was falling behind. Spanish moss, which moments ago had seemed like harmless decoration, suddenly came alive. Strands dropped from the trees like nets, wrapping around his limbs. He tore free, but more descended, and he realized with horror that the moss wasn't just falling, it was reaching for him. The moss is parasitic. Sina called out, understanding flooding through her. It's not just hanging there, it's feeding on the trees, and now it's trying to feed on you. Cresceniel staggered forward, ripping away strands of moss that were already secreting digestive enzymes, trying to break down his protective suit. Behind him, the floating islands had reached the shore and were literally crawling onto the land, their root tentacles pulling their massive bulk forward. He reached the pod just as the engines began their warm-up cycle. Vex pulled him inside, and the hatch sealed shut. Through the viewport, they watched as Spanish moss, vines, and roots completely engulfed their landing site, the plants working together to search for the prey that had escaped. The pod lifted off, tearing free from the grasping vegetation. As they rose above the swamp, the scientists could see the true scope of what they'd encountered. The entire wetland was shifting, reorganizing. The floating islands were moving in complex patterns, and beneath the water's surface, vast networks of roots and stems writhed like muscles. "It's not individual plants," Dr. Sina said softly, staring at the impossible scene below. "It's an ecosystem functioning as a single organism. A distributed intelligence using chemical signaling instead of neurons." Cresceniel slumped in his seat, his 12 eyes all focused on the swamp receding below them. Zelvar was right. We were all wrong. Earth's plants aren't passive. They're predators. Slow compared to animal life, perhaps, but patient. Strategic. And they've been this way for millions of years, Vex added. The humans evolved alongside this. They learned to survive in a world where even the forests hunt. Back aboard the Celestial Observer, the second team's report was combined with the first. The evidence was now overwhelming, impossible to dismiss. But it raised questions that terrified the galactic scientific community. Dr. Zelthar, vindicated but taking no pleasure in it, stood with Kreshanael in the observation deck, both staring at the blue-green world below. "If the plants are this dangerous," Zelthar said quietly, "what does that tell us about humanity?" Kreshanael's response was grim. "It tells us they're survivors of a level we can barely comprehend. They evolved on a death world where even standing still could get you killed. Where the forest itself is the predator. The galactic community needs to reconsider our approach to Earth," Zelthar continued. "We've been treating them as newcomers, primitives who stumbled into space travel. But a species that survived Earth's botanical warfare is far tougher than we ever imagined," Kreshanael finished. Dr. Mora joined them, her skin a contemplative shade of deep blue. "I've been reviewing Earth's agricultural history. Do you know what humans do to survive their planet's aggressive flora? They don't just avoid it, they've spent 10,000 years domesticating it. They took plants that wanted to kill them and forced them to feed them instead. Wheat, rice, corn, all were wild grasses that humans bent to their will." "Agricultural warfare," Sina added, entering the observation deck. "They didn't just survive Earth's plants. They conquered them. Selectively bred them, modified them, enslaved entire species to serve human needs." A silence fell over the group as the implications sank in. The humans weren't victims of their planet's hostile botany. They were its masters. They'd fought a war against nature itself and won. "The question," Commander Xylith said, her crystalline form reflecting the light of Earth below, "is what happens when the rest of the galaxy realizes that humanity's greatest achievement wasn't reaching space, it was surviving long enough to get there." Dr. Zelthar pulled up a file on the display, a report from the human settlement nearest their Louisiana landing site. The locals had noticed their presence, of course. The report contained an interview with an elderly human named James Boudreau, a man who'd spent his entire life in the swamps. The interviewer had asked him about the scientists' apparent panic and flight from the bayou. His response, translated and displayed on the screen, made every alien present feel a chill. "Them space folks ran from the swamp like it was gonna eat 'em. Hell, it probably would have, given time. That's just the bayou being the bayou. You want to survive out here, you gotta understand, everything's trying to kill you, but everything's also trying to live. You learn to read the signs, respect the power, and take what you need without taking too much. It's a balance. A war, maybe, but one we've been fighting so long, we don't even think about it no more. Them scientists, though. I'd bet they never been hunted by a plant before." The recording ended. The alien scientists looked at each other, then back at Earth. "We need to update humanity's classification," Dr. Kreshanael said finally. "They're not Category 7 sentients, standard technological species. They're something else entirely. Category 1, Commander Xylith suggested. Apex survivors. A species that achieved sentience not despite their planet's hostility, but because of it." Dr. Zelthar began drafting the new report, his manipulators moving swiftly across the holographic interface. Recommendation: approach humanity with extreme caution. They may seem peaceful, even friendly, but we must remember, these are beings who have spent their entire evolutionary history in a constant state of war. Not just with each other, but with their entire planet. "They're warriors," Dr. Mora said softly. "Every single one of them. They just don't look like it because on Earth, everyone has to be a warrior to survive childhood." As the report was transmitted to the Galactic Council, the scientists remained at the viewport, watching Earth rotate. Somewhere down there, in forests and swamps, deserts and tundras, humanity went about its daily life, completely unaware that the galaxy was beginning to see them not as curious newcomers, but as something far more formidable. They were survivors of a death world. They were the species that had fought plants and won. They were humanity, and the galaxy was only beginning to understand what that truly meant.